new? Got a couple people. Hello, new people. This is not our usual meeting room. We are typically in the Robert B. Schultz Lecture Theater, but there's exams going on, and there was a bit of miscommunication. So apologies, but we actually managed to get in here and get everything set up pretty well on time. My name is Brendan. I will be your host for tonight, and I will be occasionally providing live score updates, although if I don't catch it, if somebody just wants to shout out the Jets score, let me know. If the Wild score, I don't want to hear about it. Okay. So, but tonight, I'm gonna start with the beginner session. Oh, is my volume okay? People hear me just fine? Yeah. Okay, great. So I wanted to talk about catalogs and star charts. If you were here last month, Paul Gray was in, and he was talking about Barnard's catalog, and it kind of got me thinking about this topic again. I haven't done this presentation for a while, so that's why you're going to be really interested and fascinated by catalogs. Number of stars, and it is absolutely overwhelming in a good dark sky sight. And what you're going to want to try and do is, if you're into astronomy, is figure out what am I looking at? How do I find myself? Right? One of the easiest ways to do this is learning constellations. Those are recognizable patterns. We do beginner sessions on those, but tonight I want to talk about star charts. So how we've actually plotted these and cataloged the stars, and how you can reference those star charts and use them in your astronomical efforts. So going back, as humans, as we do, we were staring up into the night sky, and like I said, we were noticing these patterns and stuff like that, and that's how we ended up with constellations, because stars, the human brain just picks up patterns like nobody's business, right? And we see things like, this is kind of how, people see the face of Jesus in a piece of toast, right? It's continuing today, kind of thing, right? But in the ancient times, looking up in the night sky, seeing these stars, they would pick up these patterns. Now, from there, when you move from patterns, you start realizing that these stars are fixed points, right? So these stars are fixed points of light in the sky, to our observations, and realize that you can start using those to help orient yourself on the planet Earth. And it became very, very important to know exactly where these stars were. So how do you do that? You do the really dull, boring work of actually cataloging it. So this, we'll start with the Uranometria, which means star atlas. Uranometria. John Bayer put this together in 1603, and there were other star charts before this. I should actually mention too that in the Middle East, so you'll actually notice that a lot of stars are named, tend to have more Middle Eastern names. That's actually because a lot of astronomers in the Middle East were very, very prominent in cataloging a lot of these stars, whereas the Greeks were tending just more to catalog things like constellations, right? So groupings of stars. So anyway, we move ahead to 1603, where John Bayer put together a catalog of over 1,200 stars. This is across 51 charts. This is an example of one. Oh, we recognize a few of these, those stars up there. Bayer, now of course, like any good cataloger, came up with a designation. And like any good cataloger from that period of time, he decided to use Greek letters. So what he did was he said, okay, I'm going to take I'm going to take the brightest stars. We already have the constellations defined. I'm just going to take those groupings and I'm going to rank the stars according to brightness. So these are actually these are terms that you will come across. So if you see Alpha Orion, so we go Alpha, Beta, right? So if you see Alpha Orion, right, that is Betelgeuse, the brightest star in the constellation Orion, right? And then we get down to, now this isn't the dimmest one, but it's, dimmer, all in the tack. And so you'll see these in descending order Greek letters. So it's good to know your Greek letters if you want to roughly know what, if you're looking at a constellation that you don't necessarily recognize and you're trying to match it with the star chart, knowing that the alpha and the beta are the brightest is good to know. Moving ahead, we move to 1725, and John Flamsteed, a very prominent astronomer, made a catalog of about 3,000 stars. Contained a lot of really good stuff. One of the fun things that happens when you go and you start making catalogs is you actually end up you start plotting things, you start charting things, and you look for things, you find stuff. He didn't realize it, but he actually discovered Uranus. This wasn't officially it wasn't officially discovered until William Herschel actually figured out that it was a planet, what he was looking at. But John Flamsteed was one of the few astronomers that had actually seen it and identified it and logged it before it was actually recognized. So Flamsteed actually came up with his own designation because just having the Greek letters wasn't enough. So he came up with, now this did use a different way of cataloging them, but he used numbers instead of letters, Greek letters. And so these are ordered in increasing right ascension. So what right ascension is very quickly, it is a fixed point in the sky that you can determine something at. Now when I say fixed point in the sky, that's according to the stars, right? So as the Earth is rotating, right? Say I want to find the star Alpha Orion, it has a fixed right ascension that I can look up in a book, and that is how I can find it, by correcting for my local time. So just a brief yeah. So basically, but he cataloged them. So where Bayer's catalog was based on brightness, Flamsteed's catalog was based on position. The Henry Draper catalog is a very, very massive catalog. Annie Jump Cannon was one of the ladies that took a ton of this data and did a ton of spectral classification on this. She had a whole team of women just chewing away through this data, and they actually a lot of this ended up contributing to what we now know as HR diagrams and all the spectral classifications we have of stars. But it was really dramatic because we're talking close to 360,000 stars, and so these were all cataloged and with their spectral classifications, and similarly they're also cataloged according to position as opposed to brightness. So, but they're very dull numbers. Like we're getting they kind of get less interest. Like it's not quite as sexy as a Greek letter. So it's like HD 30453. But once you start dealing with hundreds of thousands of stars, it gets harder to find things that make sense like that. Just to give you an idea of the catalogs that are out there for stars, we have, so I was talking about the Bayer and Flamsteed catalogs. This Henry Draper one, like I said, this is one that so I highlighted the ones in green as ones that you will actually maybe come across. These are going to be rare. Like you're not going to come across this too much, but they are out there. Coincidentally, these are all Betelgeuse, by the way. The brightest star in Orion. And so these are all the various different catalogs that are out there. There's just we've had many different reasons to go and catalog a bunch of stars, and they all have various reasons and purposes, mostly. And they exist. But really the ones that I'm just throwing this out there so you guys can see the insanity that astronomy becomes. But really the ones that you mostly care about are things like, 58, Orion, you come across, Alpha Orion, you come across, maybe this HD number. Yeah. So there aren't just stars out there. We've also got some deep sky objects. So things like galaxies and nebula and star clusters, right? And so we need a way to catalog those. This is a sketch actually of the Andromeda Galaxy in all its glory. But way back when, nobody really knew what these objects, what a lot of these objects were. They kind of, if you've ever seen some of these objects in a low-power telescope, they kind of just like faint fuzzies. Even in some high-power telescopes, they look just like faint fuzzies. They're kind of these blobs, kind of thing, right? So it was hard to at the time to really scientifically say this is what these things are. And at the time, when these catalogs when these catalogs started to come out, so the Messier Catalog is one of the most famous ones. This is like the Messier Catalog is like the beginner's catalog to deep sky objects, and I'll talk a little bit about how it became that. The story goes that Messier was a comet hunter, and not a very good one, but I did credit him with the discovery of 13 comets. But he was a comet hunter, and comet hunters back then got paid money because comets were portents of doom or good crop yields or whatever kind of thing, right? So they meant they were valuable astrological things, right? Cool astronomical things for us, but back then it was an astrological thing instead. And so they got paid money if they could find these things. So he went off hunting them. The problem was that he kept coming across, and very many other ones, very many other astronomers kept coming across these faint fuzzy blobs. And those faint fuzzy blobs look potentially like comets until you root them out as not comets. In order to root them out as not comets, you need to look at them for a while. So it was kind of a waste of time. So what he did was he said, okay, you know what, forget this, I'm just going to make a catalog of all the things that aren't comets. They were his rejects. These were the things he didn't want to look at. He did not want to see these. He wanted to ignore them so he could find the comets. The true irony of this is that this became the catalog that we use to say, these are where the most beautiful objects are in the night sky. And it's, there's an event, Stan has done some talks on how you can do it, called the Messier Marathon. And I've never been able to do a complete one, but I've gotten up to like 90-something. And it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. And it's really cool because you can go off and see a whole bunch of these objects in the night sky, all in one night. Very neat. But this is, if you're starting out, the Messier Catalog is where you want to begin for deep sky objects. They're so famous that you'll often hear Messier objects referred to as just, like M101, M35, etc. So in 1888, the New General Catalog was published, which is a hilarious name because it's not that new anymore. But this was actually an update of Herschel's catalog. Herschel was a phenomenal astronomer, a very good record keeper. So this was something that was built on that. It contained about close to 8,000 objects. They're numbered NGC 1 through NGC 7840. And then there was an expansion of that called the Index Catalog, so that's how we ended up with IC 1 through IC 5386. I always wondered if the Index Catalog and the IC was a pun. I don't know if any anthropologists have gone back to tell, but I like the idea of IC 4782, That's I gotta laugh. That's good enough. Okay. Thanks, Terry. But here's the thing, though, is that NGC catalog was, so whereas Messier's catalog was kind of like, these are the objects that you can see with honestly, for the optics of the time, a good telescope, but for our day, a fairly common telescope. The NGC objects were really a much more scientific approach to it, and so they logged every little smudge, every little cluster, everything, right? There are actually many NGC objects out there that are, definitely more impressive than some of the Messier objects. There are just some that that were missed by Messier. But the thing is that there's only like 110 Messier objects. There are thousands of NGC objects, so knowing the good ones, you're going to have to go and reference which ones are the good ones, right? And that's where you get things like the Herschel 400. So this is a subset of the NGC catalog, and some of these are actually quite challenging to do, but it's a good list. And you can go online. You can go online and actually find various lists of good NGC objects. The Observer's Handbook actually has a list of fine NGC objects to go and hunt for. So the Herschel 400. I actually like this chart for reasons that have really nothing to do with the Herschel 400, other than just to use it as a way to reference things. So the red dots are all galaxies, and the yellow and green ones are all star clusters and nebulae, right? So if you look, so this is the distribution of them, right? So this is the Milky Way, right? So you're going to see all of the nebula and star clusters in there, and then the galaxies are going to be outside of, looking outside of the Milky Way, so we can see beyond. So similar to the star catalogs, we've got a whole bunch of deep sky catalogs with a lot of overlaps. This is M101, is the Pinwheel Galaxy. It has the same number all the way down to here, right? So M101, NGC 454, 57, UGC 89, 81. I think I'm just going to start calling it that to confuse people. PGC 50,063, R126, or sorry, R26. These are all the same object, spread across different catalogs, right? There's some other cool catalogs out there. The Colander catalog. If you make it out to a Sprucewood Star Party, Jerry will talk your ear off about the various open cluster catalogs out there. These are typically the kinds of clusters that you can really only see with a pair of binoculars. Telescopes have actually too much magnification, and you tend to miss the forest for the trees kind of thing. Yeah, so there's some cool objects in here. So even though the catalog has a rare name, doesn't mean that you can't see it, right? These clusters are very easy to see with a pair of binoculars. Very easy to find. Highly recommend taking a look. So now I've been talking a lot about what all these catalogs are and everything like that, but you still need to find the objects. And while we do have fancy telescopes with GO2 and all that stuff, I'm still a fan of taking a Dobsonian telescope and hunting my way around and finding stuff manually. To do that, you're going to use star charts. There's a variety of these out there. I think a lot of people actually have the Sky Atlas. It's quite good. I'll reference it a little bit later in the talk. There are crazier ones out there, like the Millennium Star Atlas. You can pay a ton of money for. There's all sorts of stuff out there. So it's kind of hard to go wrong. You can go out there, have a look at them, read the reviews, etc. One quick note: you will see the word epoch come up. Do not let it scare you. Because of effects of precession, so the Earth's wobbliness, the positions of things do actually change. I mean, the universe is not a fixed place. Things do move. They just move on very, very long time scales. So it takes about 50 years for us to really care about it. So what they'll do is, the star charts will be usually updated on about a 50-year basis, or more if they want to make some money. So right now, most star charts are probably still using J2000, which is just, the J refers to the Julian year 2000, and the next one will be 2050. But don't let it scare you, it's fine. I mean, even if you pulled up something from, if you pulled up like a J1950, it'd probably be close enough for a lot of what you're doing, but good luck finding one. Now, just because we have all these fancy star charts doesn't mean that you even need that. You can get away with, if you're just getting into astronomy and you want to go and find some stuff, there are some very, very handy all-sky maps out there. These will give you a snapshot of what the night sky looks like for a couple of months. And they look something like this. So this is actually going to be, this will be for in the summertime. And the keen observer will note that I actually just stole this from when I did this talk last, so it won't be accurate at all. So, but there's enough keen observers in here that I'm expecting to get called out at some point once you realize what's going on. Anyway, so, but regardless of that, the only thing that changes actually is just the position of the moon and the planets. Regardless, let's pretend this is 2 years ago and this is accurate. So, but if you're the whole the beauty of this though is that this really gives you a picture of what the night sky will look like, and depending on what it's printed for. So this would have been the July-August one. And so these are roughly the times that this would mostly match up at, right? So the night sky is going to, the Earth is going to rotate, and things will be setting in the west as they do, right? As this rotates. But for this point in time, this actually gives you a really good idea of what's out there, right? And so if you're just getting started, it's really good to get to know, some of the main constellations that are out there. So Hercules and Deneb. There's some ones on here that you'll recognize in the sense of, and Lyra, that's a good one too. And there's ones in here that you'll also recognize as being year-round. So Cassiopeia is over here. Your Ursa Major / Big Dipper is over here, right? So, so these are good to use, especially when you're just starting out. Now, if you're adventurous and say, well, Brendan, I don't want to just only see it in that snapshot, I want something that's more accurate, guess what? I can, if we just add like a couple pieces of paper and a really fine date picker and time picker, we can actually give you a very accurate view of the night sky at a particular period of time. Planispheres are, I think, just amazing, because it's basically a star atlas contained within, you wedge 2 pieces of paper. I mean, this is plastic obviously, but you can do it with a couple pieces of paper. We actually have these. We hand them out at public events, and it's a couple pieces of cardboard that you stick together, and you actually just get a full view of the night sky that's accurate. And actually, you can line it up to the specific date and time that you were looking at things with. Now, obviously, you don't get the planets, you don't get the moon, but you still get an accurate view of the constellations, right? So, there are, so this is the ecliptic here, so you still get that. But what you do is you take the date that you're on. So it is April the, I don't know, something after 13th, sure. Oh man, I can't really see it then. Somewhere around there, right? And then you line that up with what time it is. So this thing rotates, and you would actually rotate to say midnight. So you bring this all the way down. This whole thing would rotate, and you'd be able to use this to see what is up in the night sky. Now, you might say, but Brendan, I have this fancy cell phone, and I have this cool app that I can use to just find anything that I want. Here's the thing: this will ruin your dark adaptation, right? I love those apps; they're really cool. They're fun to use, but you're going to ruin your dark adaptation. With the red flashlight and this, you're totally fine. Right? So, old tech still works, and in some cases better than new tech. Same goes for bringing out your laptop with your planetarium software on it. Right? Do you want to know where planispheres came from? Flat spheres. So now that said, it's worth talking about that though, because there is a bit of a distortion effect that can happen. So this is Sagittarius here, the teapot part of it. This is what it actually ends up looking like on a planisphere, right? Because things kind of have to get stretched out a little bit. So, I'm just going to jump back a couple slides. If you do purchase a planisphere, which I highly recommend, make sure you get it for the right latitude. Very important. These come in various increments, so get the one closest to where you're going to be observing, likely Winnipeg. Anyway, so there will be a little bit of a distortion effect. That distortion effect is fine. It just means that you might have a little bit of a harder time, finding your way around. Yeah. So this is actually one. oh yeah, this is just a closer view of how you line them up. Right? So if it was like April 13th at midnight, wow, hey, look at that, it's like I planned this. April 13th at midnight, this is what you would see, right? And what you do is they have there are these various directions on here. So west is that way, north is that way, east is that way, and you just look up in the direction you need to look in. So we're going to jump right into star charts. So you're going to open up your star chart, and this is what you're going to see. Much like the night sky, it's kind of busy, right? And it's going to take you a little bit to get your orientation. There are some better star charts out there for beginners, like the ones in Night Watch, the Terrence Dickinson book at the back, are very good. They don't have as many stars on them, right? So it's a lot easier to find your way around. But if you do buy a fancy star atlas, this is what you're going to see. And so you're going to want to look and figure out, okay, Cepheus. Okay, that's a constellation I know, right? And then you start picking out the stars of Cepheus that you recognize, and you can start finding your way around. Right? You're going to want to reference the legend. These all have legends associated with them. They're quite nice and clean. These are galaxies, large galaxies, nebula, large nebula, planetary nebula, double star. Right? So there's all sorts of stuff here that you can look at. Right? So these are the deep sky objects that you're probably going to go and look for. This is another deep sky object. These are some cool stars that you can go and look at. Just because you see something cool in the chart doesn't mean that you can see it with your telescope. You should, if you see an object that you're interested in, maybe go look it up online, or if the chart has a guide, then it's good to reference that as well. The charts are very good at referencing stellar magnitudes. So the brighter the star, the bigger it is, the bigger it appears on the chart. So that's a handy way to get around. When you are working with the star chart, get to know your field of view. We don't talk about field of views in this session, but we should do a talk on that again at some point, because it's very handy to know. 1 degree is roughly 50 power, and it's cool. This is good to have, right? So if you know that this is a 5-degree field of view, and you are, so this is Cassiopeia, right? If you have a 5-degree field of view, you know roughly what this is going to look like in your telescope. This is really going to help when it comes to star hopping. Sorry, I am moving through this a little bit fast. We were running a little bit late. One super fancy thing that is probably borderline cheating, I find a lot of the time when it comes to observing without a computer, is the TELRAD. It kind of sounds like a fancy future computer. All it is just a red circle laser that shoots up into here. And actually, also these are killers of 9-volt batteries. Just FYI. I don't know how many times I've left stupid things on overnight. Anyway, you actually turn them on using this, and it's just this little dial that you always forget about. So you can turn up and down the brightness on it. Anyway, but the point though is that so this is sitting on the end of your telescope, right? And you can use this to find things in the night sky without any magnification at all. Now that doesn't sound like it would be helpful to a beginner maybe, but being able to line your telescope up without any magnification is super handy, and I'll show you why. First things first though, you need to know that these are representative of various sizes, okay? So the first circle that you see, so if I go back here, this is what you see when you look into it. I go to here, this is ½ a degree. This is 2 degrees, and this is 4 degrees. Okay? This is really handy. Now, you can see that this is kind of distorted. This is a picture I took for my star atlas, and it actually comes with a little TELRAD finder. So it's got this little plastic thing that you can overlay on your star chart. So you can super cheat. You just take this thing out, and you can use it to find stuff really easily. And I'll show you how to do that by picking one of the easiest objects to find in the night sky. Which is M13. It's a spectacular globular cluster in Hercules. If you've not seen it through a telescope, you are missing out. So, we pull up our star chart. There's stars everywhere. It's filled with them. But we've recognized we found our constellation of Hercules, right? And this is M13. This is what we want to find. Okay, well, that should be easy enough, right? So you take the telescope up. You got a bunch of magnification on it. and you end up hunting around all over here, and then before you know it, you start doing this, right? And then you look up and you say, what the heck was I doing? You know, and then you pull your telescope back up here, and then you keep doing it, and you think you're going this way, but in fact you're actually going that way because you didn't realize which way it was going, and you know, here. So, this is what we want to try and find. This is a good reference star. Let's take a little bit of a closer look. We pull up our fancy Telrad finder, which is these circles. So like I said, these are the degrees that you can use, and you stick your. I'm good. So if you stick it here and line it up on this, right? You will know that this is roughly how far away that is, right? So if you line up this circle on here, then when you're pointing your telescope up, and you line up this circle on here, then you'll know roughly how far away you are from this. So then what you can do is, again, using this, you can move this down, and you know that basically if you can get roughly to the point where your Telrad is situated around here compared to this star in Hercules, the object that you want to find should be right around there. If you know your field of view, that's the important piece. So you do need to know the field of view of your, with the eyepiece that you're using, right? So getting to know those numbers, very important. It'll help you a lot. So this is the kind of thing that I found when I was starting out removed a lot of headache. It gave me a bit of a systematic approach. It doesn't have to be this complicated. Honestly, I've eyeballed this, hundreds of times, right? But if you're trying to hunt something down that you're not, particularly in an area of sky that you're not familiar with, it's a very handy technique. So, so I recommend it. That was everything for the beginner session. So, thank you. Oh, hello. I'm back. You guys are really going to get sick of me tonight. So I just did the beginner session. I will be your host for tonight. My name is Brendan, if you didn't remember that from a half hour ago. I am the current president of the Winnipeg Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. You should know who we are if you're here. I think I asked if there are new people. So, by the way, if you are a new person, come say hello during the break. I might be watching hockey, but come say hi. It'd be cool to meet you if I haven't yet. Also, speaking of, last I checked, there was no score. So I just went through our beginner session on star charts and catalogs. I will be running. So this is our agenda for tonight, by the way. I'm going to run through some announcements. You will get a break from me. Brian will come down and do a what's up. I will then come back to do a what's new. Ian, regrettably, has lost his voice. So he was unable to make it tonight. So I threw something together. Let's hope it's not that. Then we'll do a refreshment break. So that's where you can come say hi and try to distract me from a hockey game. And then Jerry will be... he keeps using the word lecture, which I think is a little intimidating. I think he'll be teaching us about the Copernican Revolution, and maybe striking up some fun conversations for Boston Pizza later. So, very much looking forward to that. Anyway, into the announcements. We have some upcoming meeting changes. Things got a little... tonight was a meeting change that I didn't even know about, but these ones I do know about. So for the May meeting, I'll talk about this in a little bit. We're going to be holding it at the Manitoba Museum. It's actually going to be right next to the planetarium in the down the stairs there. They've got a little auditorium there. I will send all of this out in email form. So if your email is not updated with the RASC, you should really do that. That's typically how I communicate out to the club. I don't use the list. I use the RASC, whatever email you have with the RASC. So they have that on file. I take that and I send those emails out. So if you're not getting those, definitely update your email address with the national site. So June, normally we have a barbecue. We will be having a regular meeting in the Robert B. Schultz Lecture Theater. The reason why is because things worked out and we actually have a special guest speaker who's going to be coming through at that time, and it seems silly to pass up on the opportunity. He'll actually be talking about the history of the Hubble Space Telescope, and it'll be a fairly interesting talk. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then we're bumping the barbecue to July. So that is the plan for the next few months, and then August will return to normal. So for the main meeting, so what actually happened here was the Manitoba Museum is celebrating their 50th? Yes. Actually, their 50th anniversary. So they are holding a big bash the night of our regular scheduled meeting. So Scott Young reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to do a thing? And I said, yeah, sure, let's do a thing. And then we bounced back and forth on stuff, and we've kind of worked out a plan. It'll be similar to the normal meeting, is what we're expecting to happen. There will be a special guest speaker that I am going to announce right now. That'll be Alan Dyer. So, yeah. So if you don't know Alan Dyer, he is a Winnipeg alum. Actually, he helped. I think he helped paint the observatory way back when down in Glenley. He's a phenomenal speaker. I've seen him a couple times, and he's a very accomplished astrophotographer. If you have a copy of Sky News, or he's got a column in there usually in the reviews and stuff like that, so you've seen his name, you've definitely seen his pictures. If you have a calendar, you've seen his pictures. So he does phenomenal work, so I'm really looking forward to that. In addition to this, there will be a ticketed event, so it'll be kind of a, Scott was saying that there would be drinks and food. I don't have details on that yet, but he said he'd be willing to work out some sort of discount for RASC members. So I'll let everyone know about that as soon as I find it out. So it will get blasted out on the email list. I'll update the website as well with all of this. So that is currently in the works. So I'm excited. Meanwhile, something that I had really no involvement whatsoever, but worked out beautifully, was Ralph planned another gallery for us at the Millennium Library. And if you haven't got to check it out, you should go and check it out. There's some really amazing work from our club in that gallery. I really recommend checking it out. A lot of effort went into it, and it'll be up until the end of the month.
Brendan?
Yes?
It's in the Blankstein Gallery on the second floor of the Millennium Library.
Yes, thank you. You have to go. It takes a little bit to find. Like you have to kind of go down and then up because you can't access it externally from the second floor. You need to go down first and then up.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. So, but if you ask somebody, they'll point you in the right direction. So Astronomy Day is coming up. For those who typically who have helped us out in the past, we usually do this at the chapters by Polo Park. They had a conflict, so we're going to be doing it at the Indigo on Keniston. It was the best I could do on short-ish notice. Excuse me. But it'll be on Saturday from 11 to 5. If you're interested in helping out, that'd be great. We're looking for volunteers. We'll have the solar scope set up, and we'll have a table with outreach material. Generally, all you have to do is just stand around and talk to people about astronomy. It's pretty easy. I've been doing it for like an hour now. Yeah, but we are looking for volunteers. So if you're willing to help out, that'd be great. Let me know, or anybody on council know. So it'd be nice to have you out. Next month, very similar thing. The U of M is taking part in a nationwide event called Science Rendezvous. So there's a bunch of stuff happening around the university, and they like to have us out with our solar telescopes. That one's even easier because we don't even really have to. We just have to set up our solar telescopes and show people the sun. So that's great. So if you want to help out, let me know. I'll likely put you in contact with Danielle, who's kind of organizing it. I'm kind of organizing a little bit too. We'll figure that out. But just contact me if you want to help next? We've got a lot of stuff going on. It's a busy club. White Shell Public Event. This is something that Mike organized, Mike Caracas. So we were out there last year we went to Batula Lake and set up a telescope. It was kind of an ad hoc thing, and we got a bunch of people. This year we're doing it really nicely, and we're getting the park directly involved, and we're expecting a decent crowd. So we actually already have quite a few volunteers, which is great. But if you want to help out at all, Mike's over there. Just look for the hand there. If you want to help out at all, talk to Mike, and he'd be appreciated. I forgot to put the public event for Spruce Woods. What is it again?
The weekend of August 8th.
Okay, so the Spruce Woods Star Party. So we do a public event with the park. So it's the weekend of August 18th. If you'd like to help out with that, talk to Sylvia.
Sure.
I guess, or me. That's fine too. And just make yourself known. But if you want to have a good time, it's probably a terrible way to open with that. But if you want to have a fun time with some astronomers, you can come to the Spruce Woods Star Party at Spruce Woods Park. Anyway, sorry, I've been up here too long already. But yeah, you should come to the Spruce Woods Star Party. It is my favorite thing to do astronomically every single year. I always have a blast there. We got rained out. We got totally rained out last year, and I still had a blast. It was cool, like because you're hanging out with a bunch of like-minded people and enjoying each other's company. And if things work out, you can observe the night sky, right? And that's what we hope for. But we've got some good talks. We've got a speaker coming in from the University of Brandon, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. So University of Brandon. So Jonathan Rice is going to be coming in. So that'll be great. Still trying to line up another one, I think. And yeah. So highly recommended. I will. Basically, I will push the Spruce Woods Star Party until I die. Just go. It's a lot of fun. So. Back into so that is the long-term, kind of public event stuff. We do have some regular events that happen month to month. One of them is the Okanagan Marsh Astronomy Night. The next one is this coming Thursday, April 19th. Starts at 8, goes to 10. I believe the topic for this month is telescopes. I think so. So this is a cool event. We've had a long-standing tradition of helping out with this. I recommend going out there. It's a good dark sky. There is a $10 entry fee, but that will be waived for RASC members helping out with telescopes. So, show up with a telescope and yeah. So, what else? The open house at the planetarium. Danielle has been doing these. I don't know if she's here. I don't think she is. Okay, no Danielle. But she's been running these. The next one is April 25th. So. If there's anything that comes of this, I will send it out via the list. Telescope loans. We have, if you are a member, we have telescopes, and we loan them. That's why this is titled Telescope Loans. There are quite a few. Well, we have quite a two telescopes. We have two Dobsonians that we loan out. We also have the solar telescope, which I think is taken up for this month. Stan, what is the status on the other two?
I'm actually getting one back for maintenance, and the other one's out of the two Dobs. But people need to get a hold of me earlier.
Yep.
It's easier than just sitting tonight.
Yep.
Somebody's asked to have one extended for another month, so I've granted that. And the solar scope is back, but we're holding on to it for next week for Astronomy Day.
Yep. So yeah. So definitely really important.
And then it's booked for next month.
Right. So get your name in. Get your name in to Stan. These are hot commodities. But these are really great scopes to go out and learn the night sky with. They're easy to set up, easy to use, and yeah, we keep them in good shape. Like Stan said, we do some maintenance on them and try to keep them up to spec. If the loaner scopes aren't enough for you, we also have our observatory south of the city, down in Glenley. This is open to all members. If you'd like a key, you can talk to Brian. He'll be up here in a minute. Don't talk to him then. Maybe wait till the break. But he can get you a key, and he can walk you through how to use the observatory. and the telescopes that we have here. Coincidentally, we're going to do a members observing night. So this is for members. This is our lovely observatory. And yeah, so we're doing it Sunday night. Tomorrow night was a no-go, unfortunately, but we're going to try it for Sunday night. So if you want to show up around 9 o'clock at the Lunley Observatory. And that does it for announcements. Brian, would you like to come down and give us what's up in the next panel? Is there anything else? Anyone else have anything else to announce? Are we good? I talked a lot. There's a lot of stuff, so I'm pretty sure I got it.
All right, thank you, Brendan. Take a little short break. Okay, so let's talk about what's up. You good? Am I good? Good, thanks. All right, so what's up for the month of April? All right, expecting, okay, so we're gonna, does this work? Oops. Wait. Do I have to stand here? Wait, no, wait. Okay. All right. It's supposed to play, but it looks like it's not. Is it going to play now? Nope. Okay, there it is. Okay, let's start off with the planets. Let's start off automatically. Okay, we're going to start off with Mercury, shall we? Well, a little close there, but we'll try. Mercury now. Basically, Mercury is going to be your morning planet. It is going to be stationary, meaning that to the background stars, it's not going to move. Not much more I can say about Mercury, so let's move on to Venus. Venus, again, it'll be more like your day planet, but it's going to have like a just weird kind of travel. It's going to travel up in diagonal away from the sun, so that's kind of unusual for Venus. And of course, it's going to meet up with the moon on the 17th. All right, which we have Mars. I love Mars. Mars is one of my favorite planets, and this year it's going to get really close, especially on July the 27th. The reason why I want to mention it now because probably won't be able to talk about it in May and maybe a little bit of June maybe. So just to give you a heads up, we're looking at July 27th, where Mars is going to be at the closest point. Currently its brightness is only 18, and of course in conjunction with Saturn and of course Mars on April 2nd. Next we have Jupiter. Jupiter is in the retrograde motion right now. I'll give you a little animation on it, but it's going to pretty well be stationary again to the constellation. And it's pretty bright, a magnitude of -2. Now Saturn. Well, it says, I have here, it's going to first reach a stationary point on April 18th, and it being this retrograde motion. Again, it's a constellation. I'm going to show you a little animation to talk about what I'm talking about. This is a little awkward for me right now. Okay, so this laser pointing work. Okay, so I'll just kind of give you an overview. July is 27. This is where we're going to catch up with Mars and Earth right about here. So again, Saturn's going to move. There's Venus. Venus is going to travel. If this is the horizon, Venus is going to go up towards relative to the sun. And this is what it's going to look like at April the 15th. Of course, 5:30 in the morning, roughly. We have, oops, too far. So that should be Jupiter right there. And there's Saturn, there's Sagittarius constellation, and of course we have Mars. What's kind of unique about this is, again, I'll show you the animation, is that Saturn and Jupiter is not going to move, but Mars is not going to move either. It's going to pretty much stay against the sky. I'm going to show you in a second. This animation is going to play. Hopefully that's it. It's playing. Okay, again we have Jupiter right there. We have Saturn and Sagittarius, and then we have Mars. And give it a couple of seconds. It's going to start up. I'm going to show you what you mean. Mars is going to stay right exactly about here. It's not going to move a whole lot for the next month. Of course, you can see Saturn and Jupiter. They're not going to move much against the star constellations. I thought it was going to be, and then we're, of course, in May, but something I kind of discovered when I was playing around with the software. All right, what do we have for April? Not much, other than a couple planets, Mercury and Saturn. It's going to be stationary. Of course, we have the Lyric Meteor Shower on April, do I have it? On April 22nd. But we're competing with the moon, which is going to set roughly about 3 o'clock in the morning, so that's not going to happen for us. And what's a good night too? It's going to be Saturday night. Of course, the full moon is on April the 30th. Let's talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk a little bit about May, because I don't know if I'll be able to talk about May, what's going to happen in May with our meeting in Planetarium. But we do have the Retrograde Meteor Shower on May the 5th. There's a good chance for us seeing that one. It's going to be Saturday, so May the 5th. And the moon's going to start to rise around about 2 o'clock in the morning. So I think I might be able to host that, and might have some good scenes. Okay, Moon and Hades. I kind of discovered this today when I was going through some magazines. I don't think that's supposed to be scale, but it was a little big to me, if you ask me. But unfortunately, it's going to happen on April 18th, which happens to be my birthday. But it's going to be pretty low in the sky when it gets dark enough. So you're not going to see much about it. So roughly, this is about, of course I have it here, it's at 9:30 p.m. So have a look at that. What else do we have? Okay, the Lyric Meteor Shower. Like I said, we have the half moon to compete with. It's going to set around 3 o'clock in the morning. What do I have here? Of course, it's about 20 meters per hour. Hopefully, we'll see that. But of course, like I said, we're competing around with the half moon, and it's going to set around 3 o'clock. So I don't think that's going to really happen with the moon. Now, this is kind of like for the new members, like what's the best way of seeing it. This is supposed to give you an idea of which direction you should be facing at different times. But like I said, we're going to be competing with the full moon or half moon, so that's not going to happen. Now, the Retrograde Meteor Shower. I labeled this as red, and then, of course, it's going to overlap. So what I'm trying to say here is there's a really good chance that there's going to be a lot of meteor shower or a lot of meteors going to happen during that time. So hopefully, if you're up that night and if it's clear, then there's a good chance you might be seeing something, maybe this weekend. And of course, the moon starts to rise around 2:15, so again, I think we have a good chance of hosting it on Saturday, which is a good time for me, because then I don't have to work the next day. And I think it's going to be good for everyone. Okay, again, this is kind of like briefly, this is why I kind of mentioned that this type of meteor shower is really best to see at like 3 o'clock early in the morning. So again, this is kind of the direction to look at when viewing it. But most people that I find that go to this meteor shower at Glen, they show up around 10, maybe 11 o'clock, they go around for a couple of hours, and you get tired and go home. Right? But we'll see how that goes. All right, that's all I have to say. Thank you. Jets are up on nothing. All right. Nothing. Jets are up on nothing. Okay, next one. My usual recommendation when it comes to meteor showers is definitely well, don't wear these glasses. But second is make it a relaxing evening for yourself. Like just going out with a lawn chair, and bring some binoculars with you. Just have a look at some of those open star clusters out there, and maybe some of the brighter Messier objects that you might be familiar with. It's kind of a nice time, and you can just sit there and just stare up at the night sky and see a few little shooting stars, and it's worth doing. So, as I said, Ian regrettably couldn't make it tonight. I tried pulling in some ringers. It was kind of short notice, didn't work out. So I threw this together. It will not be up to Ian Cameron standards, but it's not on a Mac at least. So there's that.
But, I just remember that we tape these now, so I gotta play. I guess you can tell him I said that. Anyway, yeah. So, but I put together some just these are just things that I remembered from the past month or so. So I don't know, and I'm trying to keep it fairly grounded. I am not a scientist by any stretch. I don't know any of this stuff. I don't know any of this stuff very well. So if you have questions, you can just save them for Ian next time. So, item 1. Life on Venus. Like, you wouldn't think so, right? Like, you wouldn't think so. And no, we have not discovered life on Venus. But one of the fun things that I really like that's been happening, in the past, I guess it's been going maybe on for longer, but like, as far as I'm concerned, what's been happening in the past, 10, 15 years, is this real focus on the concept of these extremophiles and these creatures that can survive in these deep vents on Earth, the tardigrades that can survive out in space for a long time, and it's gotten people thinking about, well, what if we could find some of these microbes running around in various areas, and actually, potentially finding life not on Earth, right? So, trying to find life on the surface of Venus is, it's ridiculous, right? Rains sulfuric acid, it's a horribly inhospitable place. However, the cloud tops, actually, because of the thickness of the clouds, have a fairly good pressure and temperature to potentially support life. And what these folks did is they looked at all of the spectral data that we have for Venus over the years. There's actually there are these dark patches that tend to show up in a lot of these Venus observations, and they really don't have a ton of there isn't a very good sense of like what these are. Now it's very important to state that it's not like they have detected life. There's been zero detection of anything. But they are looking at the possibility of it and promoting the idea that maybe we should send something there to try and take some better samples, right? And so potentially, sampling the cloud tops for some sort of for some microbes could work. And they actually did. I don't know. I read through at least a little bit of the paper, and they did some fairly good work in looking at the various UV levels and that sort of thing. So it's an interesting idea. Obviously the chances of this happening are like them finding anything or anyone finding anything is pretty remote. But I thought it was an interesting idea and an interesting approach. The way that you would potentially do this is you send off one of these super light aircraft. The idea is, this is something that they've been cooking up for a while now, which is, rather than worrying, sending a spacecraft to Venus, don't worry about landing the thing. Just get it in the cloud tops, right, and do your science from there, right? So that's kind of where they're going with this. So the hope is that if we could potentially send something, we could go and sample the cloud tops and see what we see. Item 2, life on Proxima B. I've got a theme. Answer, likely no. This is something that, so if you're not familiar, so Proxima B is a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri, and it was really, people were really excited. I'm going to jump back a slide, sorry. People were excited because it was using the radial velocity method. They found this rocky planet that orbited at a good distance in the Goldilocks zone from the star. The problem is, and this is a problem that I actually talked to Ian about way back when this first came up, is that it's a red dwarf. Red dwarfs are known for their flares. And that's a real problem. And since then, they've actually detected one. So you can actually see it here, right? And so you get this, right? So this is the star, right? And like these red dwarfs they're quite violent and somewhat unpredictable, right? So you get these little beeper flares that crop up, right? So to give you an idea, it increased by a brightness factor of 68 during the superflare, and released a volumetric energy of big number, 10 times larger than any previously detected flare from Proxima, right? So these things are happening kind of on the regular, right? There's a problem with this. I'll just read this out. While ozone in an Earth-like planet's atmosphere can shield the planet from intense UV flux associated with a single superflare, so this is something like on Earth, so if we got hit by a massive flare, the atmospheric ozone recovery time after a superflare is on the order of years. So when we get hit by this massive flare, ozone can recover, right? And a sufficiently high flare rate can therefore permanently prevent the formation of protective ozone layer. So this is basically what they're saying is that Proxima b is getting slammed by these things so often that there's just no time for its ozone layer to pick up, right? Provide a way to prevent any radiation damage, yada yada yada, right? So yeah, probably not a good candidate for life, but this is all part of what we should be doing. We should be looking at these saying, hey, cool, we found some really good candidates. Let's go look at them more closely and see what they're like. Because who knows, with stuff like Breakthrough Starshot, 100 years from now, we might actually be able to send something to these, to these places. And if we're going to send them, we should send them to the best ones. This is where my theme just completely breaks apart. So, item 3. A galaxy lacking dark matter. This one was fairly big news, so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people heard about this. But NASA was looking at this galaxy, NGC 1052 DF2. You should all know what NGC means because you remember me talking about that. New General Catalog. The DF2. So this is actually a very diffuse galaxy that interacts, that they believe interacts or is associated with the NGC object 1052. So the DF2 on top of this is just, it's kind of like NGC 1052 adjacent, generally what that is getting at. So this is the galaxy itself. It is incredibly diffuse. So I'll tell you what they found, but it is at a distance of 62 million light years. It's got a larger angular size than our Milky Way. It is, but despite being that big, it has 250 times fewer stars. Hence why they classified it as ultra diffuse. One of the scientists on the paper was actually saying that it's striking because you can actually basically just see right through it. You can see galaxies on the other side quite clearly all the way through this all the way through this ultra diffuse galaxy. Now, what was really interesting about this and why this made some news is that it had 400 times less dark matter than predicted. So the problem here is not so much, now, and to be clear, this isn't to say that they are detecting dark matter, but it is not as massive as it should be, right? And the problem with that isn't so much, it's not to say that this isn't a point against dark matter existing or not, but what this is a point against we don't understand how this galaxy was formed. So right now, galactic formation models rely heavily on dark matter in order to explain how they were formed and how they could be. We don't have that for this. So that's what this is kind of opening up. Yeah, so there's no theory that predicts these types of galaxies. How you actually go about forming one of these things is completely unknown. So that's what's interesting about this. It's a type of galaxy that we now actually have no concept of how it came to be. News item 4, Icarus. So I think a bunch of people probably heard about this one. Does everyone remember, I don't know who was here, but Adam Rogers gave a talk on gravitational lensing. It was very, very good. This was something found using gravitational lensing. So first off, Icarus is they call it Icarus. Fancy name, whatever. But they called it Icarus, and but what it actually is it's the furthest star that we have observed. The furthest single star that we have observed. And the way it was done is, it was, yeah, that little point right there. Like that's the furthest single star that we have observed. The way this was done was using a technique called gravitational lensing. So, Einstein's theory of general relativity describes how large amounts of mass, in this case, a cluster of galaxies, so not a single galaxy, but a cluster of galaxies, at the right distance away, bends the light such that we can see beyond it, right? And now, what's cool is that in 2011, we couldn't see this, right? In 2016, we can. What's actually happening there is, these are the subtle variations, like a lens isn't perfect. What's happening here is that these are the subtle variations in the lens that are actually allowing us to see this thing. So we were just looking at it and we kind of got lucky that the lens was just, we were just angled in just the right way to be able to see this star. Right? So what do we, what do we know about it? This galaxy cluster, by the way, is about 5 billion light years away. So this star is really, really far. We know that based on the spectral data that we took, that it is likely a blue supergiant. So the observational data is are these red ones, red dots, right? And then this is the expected plot of a blue supergiant of brightness versus wavelength. Okay, so matches up pretty nicely. So pretty good bet that it's a blue supergiant star. So that's what we know about it. But yeah, so very cool. It's something we've been able. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating that not only were we able to see it, but we're actually able to get this decent spectral data out of it. So quite nice. Item 5. I felt like I felt like I needed to say something about this. So when I was a teenager, I was super passionate about astrophysics, and I was like, I really want to get into this, right? And like this man was able to do these astounding things despite being in a wheelchair, and he contributed just an amazing amount to the field and to everything, right? And so I wanted to throw this up here. I'm actually really I'm really happy that I found this picture, because I think it's great, because it's like the one picture of him in his later years where he's not in a wheelchair, right? And he's just floating around. If you don't know what this is a picture from the Bonnet Comment. Stephen Hawking always wanted to go into space, right? This is his dream. He wanted to go into space, right? And they went through an incredible amount of effort to get him up into this. So what the Bonnet Comment is, it's I forget what model plane it is. Does anyone remember? It's basically a jet, but it's a jet airplane that NASA has. And what they do is
DC-9, I don't know if it's still there.
Is it a 747 or DC-9? Something about that size, but a fairly big jet, right? And so what they do is they take you up in these parabolic arcs, right? And they just go up and down these parabolic arcs, and what it does is it simulates weightlessness, right? And Stephen Hawking really wanted to get into space, and regrettably did not make it, but incredibly got this far, right? And I find that just a testament to our species. I think it's incredible. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you all on that. We will break for refreshments. And we will come back at 8:45, where Jerry will tell us all about the Copernican Revolution. Paul Stasi just scored. It's 2-0 Jets. You may continue making. I'm kidding. Okay, we're gonna get started. So you can all find your way back. I thought about trying to make that work. Unfortunately, fortunately, Jerry has a fascinating subject to go over tonight. This, I don't know, I'm going to preamble a little bit because I want to. Because I've been talking a lot tonight and I'm just going to keep doing it. So, whatever. So, this, if you've ever been to Boston Pizza after a meeting, by the way, we're going to Boston Pizza after the meeting. I highly recommend coming out. I highly recommend it also because I won't be there. So if you're tired of me, you won't see me there. When there have been very many nights where things have gotten very, very late, and there's a lot of empty pictures around, and Jerry and a few of us will be standing around just discussing the philosophy of science. And you know, it is a really fascinating subject because we tend to look, and I don't want to spoil any of Jerry's talk, but I do think we tend to look at science in a way that is a little bit cold. And I think that there's a strong human element that kind of runs through it. And a lot of discussions that I've had with Jerry about this tend to gravitate more towards that. So there's going to be, what you can expect in this is a lot of history. 3-0. 3-0. Yes. Glad you guys care about me. No, it's fine. I actually care more about the score than I do myself. It's fine. Yeah, 3. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the year that we're starting this talk in there. Sorry. Okay. But what you can expect is various wooing as the Jets demolish a while, and interspersed with that, Jerry will be going into some history and presenting, I think, some really good perspective on how we have gotten to where we are today.
Excellent.
So, Jerry, take it away.
So I'm not going to bother using the microphone. If I get too loud, just let me know. I'll try and tone it down.
Can you repeat that?
Deaf Kennedy. Okay, first of all, I have to start with a bit of an apology because this was the topic, subject matter that I gave to all you people to look at. But really, what I wanted to talk about was this. Now, some of you might be getting a few ideas, inklings that, okay, he's going to probably be evaluating certain historical accounts and trying to evaluate them with a little historiography. And, okay, that'd be kind of cool. That's acceptable. That could be even more entertaining. But my topic actually has a subtitle to it. What does this historical episode really say about the nature of science? Now, some of you are going to start saying, this is starting to sound like that philosophy of science stuff again. But don't leave. It's a minimal amount. It's a minimal amount. Lock the doors. It's a minimal amount, and you shouldn't get infected from this. At best, it might, vaccinate you so that you'll be able to tolerate more of it in the future. Here's our circumstance. I found a very descriptive quote of what we are trying to deal with here. We trust our predecessors when they say that the Earth orbits the Sun without understanding how they came to believe that. We belittle people who disagree with, without understanding the arguments that make us correct. It turns out that the story of scientific discovery is always messy, usually fascinating, often wildly contingent, that's something I'm going to stress, and occasionally well told. Whenever we can grapple with not only the results of scientific inquiry, but also the story behind it, we should. And I heartily endorse this sentiment. Here's what we're fighting. Now, those of you who have studied history will be aware of this problem, and especially if your history deals with political issues. Whig history is the historical accounts that present the past as leading to a particular aspect of the present situation, rather than being a more comprehensive account. It makes it look like the past was just working towards the present situation. it makes this easy to talk about things like progress and cumulative knowledge. In the political history, there's a slogan that goes along with it. History is written by the victors, the winners. And in the history of science, there's something very similar. It's history is written by those with vested interests that are trying to promote some idea or some particular way of viewing things. And an awful lot of the historical accounts we get are trying to do exactly that. Now, not that it's always bad. For instance, one of the most obvious places to see Whig history, history that's been kind of told to you with a purpose, is in our textbooks, especially our textbooks in school. Our teachers are liars. But the idea here is sound. What you're trying to do is convince these people that there's something worth going after here. So we tell these little fairy tales to the children that allow us to go off and convince them that this is something worth doing, something relevant. So we tell Whig historical accounts to allow us to hook students, and then later on, hopefully, they go to university and we can tell them the truth at that point. These Whig historical accounts are simple, they're usually overly confident and bold in the reports that they make, and they need to be supplanted by more complicated and more complete, less biased accounts. A tough thing to do in a lot of ways, as you'll see, because we've got some very good historians in this account that did some rather dissatisfactory things. And the rationale behind all of this is that it's this, our history defines and gives us justification for so much of the way in which we view the world and the way in which we present or talk about even things like science or politics or art. And so, if we don't get this right, there's going to be some miscarriage of justice. So, what's the fairy tale that we tell children about the Copernican Revolution? Well, here's a list of very brave, rugged individualists that, challenged authorities and went off to do wonderful things and gave us this great account of what science is really about. Starting with Copernicus here, who apparently was faced with astronomy that was in crisis. It was a mess. It didn't work very well anymore. It was overly complicated. It was bloated. These models that had been presented up until this time had gotten so old that the science was falling apart. So along comes Copernicus, and rather than trying to fix the old wreck, he just sort of built a new vehicle for astronomy to work with. Kepler, as a young fellow, was so impressed with Copernicus's account, saw the immediate value in it, cleaned it up, purged it of the last of the old ancient Ptolemaic problems, and gave us the clean modern version that we know today. Galileo, with his trusty telescope at hand here, was able to show that the old Ptolemaic system that existed wasn't doing a very good job here and was actually being falsified by his new results. And his telescope was also confirming the truth of the Copernican model. And he was also doing physics on the side as well that allowed him to challenge the physics standards of the time, which was Aristotelian physics. And then this led, of course, to Newton on the end here, who, through his theories of gravitation, was able to describe what was going on in this great entire picture. His mathematics that he developed allowed him to derive the motions that Kepler had discovered and tied it all together neatly in a bow, and we all lived happily ever after. Now, to understand what Kepler or Copernicus was reacting to, you have to look at what was the science that came before. And so that's what we're going to spend a bit of time doing here. First of all, let's talk about what astronomy was all about before there was telescopes. First of all, astronomers were usually referred to as mathematicians. Most of what they did was some kind of clever geometry. Physics, as we understand it, and it was called natural philosophy back then, was a separate issue. That was stuff having to do with the cosmology and the causal forces and the whole big story of the universe. That was quite separated from astronomy. Astronomy was more like where and when are the planets. Now there was two ways back then for astronomers to earn a paycheck. The first one had to do with timekeeping, mostly having to do with determining local noon so that clocks or whatever in that town could be set. They were also responsible for a lot of calendar work so that you could determine things like religious holidays. This was a big, big issue, as you'll see in this time frame. The other thing they did, for the most part, was prognostications. Yes, they cast horoscopes. That was their big moneymaker. Most astronomers at the time were either at a university that was funded by some rich and powerful people, or they were directly employed by rich and powerful people trying to get an edge on other rich and powerful people. So this is one of the best ways to make money. And their tasks, their duties were quite wide. For instance, astrology also included medicine. Plagues were sweeping through Europe at this time, and astronomers / astrologers were being asked, why? When? Where are these things happening? And this was serious business. Half of Europe, half the population of Europe disappeared in the 1300s. Didn't recover for several centuries because of the Black Death and other plagues that went through it. The astronomers were being held responsible for trying to help deal with this issue. And they're supposed to do it from the positions of the planets. And meteorology, which, okay, now this explains, Jay's not here, but I'll get Jay to explain to us just how much of astrology is still left in his business. The prime directive of the astronomers was this slogan, to save the appearances. Astronomers were supposed to tell us when and where to expect the planets and the stars. That's what they were all about. Now, they recognized their task. We didn't have direct access to that stuff out there, so we had to do something that was maybe a little more modest than what you'd want to do as a true scientist. They all were feeling the force of Plato's cave allegory. Plato, ancient philosopher, who said, think of some people chained up in a cave who couldn't see the real world out there, and all they saw was the shadows cast on the opposite wall. And all these chained up people in the cave could do was look at the shadows. Well, eventually they would start to develop ideas and theories about what's going on out there in the real world, even though they couldn't see it. That's the position that many astronomers found themselves in. And some were quite happy with that. Others weren't. In philosophical terms, this is the difference between a realistic account in science, a realistic theory, versus one that is merely instrumentalist. One that just gives you the result you're looking for, but doesn't make any great claims to the reality that might exist beyond. The biggest problem that they had to deal with was the problem of retrograde motion. It was something that dogged them from the beginning, and in some ways they wrestled with it right to the end. So here's the two main characters that we need to know about from the ancient times. This is our physicist, natural philosopher. Every time philosophy got close to doing something that was progressive and making progress towards understanding something, they changed the name, called it a different subject, took it away from the philosophers and said, go back to the impossible things. Okay? So, at this time, physics was still part of their enterprise. So we have the philosopher Aristotle talking about what could be going on in the heavens. Now what we needed was a causal mechanism for motion. And when Aristotle looked around the world, and actually when I say Aristotle, I'm talking about a whole group of thinkers from back then. When Aristotle looked around the world and said, movement like we see in the sky, there's nothing down here that moves like it in the sky. The closest thing we have that moves really easily down here, without having to keep pushing it and adding force to it, is, well, the chariot wheels are pretty good. Our wheels are close. Better yet, a ball, a sphere, on a nice smooth surface, that almost rolls effortlessly. If this was more perfected, if the ball was more perfected, if the surface it ran on was more perfected, you might have something that could move without effort. And matter of fact, that might even be its natural state to be in motion if it was a perfect spherical object. Nothing like that to be found down here. So, with a causal mechanism, and about the only thing they could imagine as a causal mechanism in place, they started to make models of how this could reflect what's going on in the sky. And this perfect motion that they talked about was uniform circular motion. That's what a sphere can do best. If it wasn't uniform motion, then something was mucking about with it. If you could slow down or speed up, then that's not the perpetual stuff that we think can exist. So uniform circular motion is our causal mechanism. And then they tried to apply it to what they saw in the sky and the planets. It fails miserably. It doesn't work. But we're humans. We can't be without an explanation. It's almost like mansplanation, you know. You've got to have an explanation for this stuff. So we never gave up on it. What we did is we just made more clever and more complicated models. Here is a nested set of spheres, all of them able to move perpetually on their own. And you can see where the axes are put on here. And this clever bit actually can get you a surprising degree of motion. This was due to one of our boys, Eudoxus. This stuff eventually fails as well. It's not good enough for what we need. So they developed different models, again using spheres, because the only causal mechanism we have is uniform circular motion. So along comes Ptolemy, and he develops this system, where these little circles, perfect little spheres, able to move perpetually on their own, are found on larger spheres. And hopefully he could capture the motion with that. Let's set our situation a little better. Here's a bit of a timeline, so we're up to 200 AD here. Here's Aristotle and his buddy Eudoxus that gave us those early models of the nested spheres, otherwise known as homocentric spheres. These two guys were around 400 to 300 BC. Eratosthenes is the fellow who measured the Earth and found its size. So back around this point, we already knew the size of the sphere of the Earth. We had Aristarchus, the ancient Copernican, the fellow who thought that maybe the sun was the center. And then you've got Hipparchus, who gave us one of the best star catalogs of the ancient time, and also gave us one of the devices that we're going to use to talk about in the future, the Eppie Cycle. And then you have a long period of time before you finally get to Ptolemy, our boy who's given us the best account. So, the ancient world gets its science, its astronomy perfected right back here with Ptolemy, and Copernicus would be someplace about over here on this timeline. Great gap in there. Ptolemy's system was thoroughly adequate and successful for like 1,300 years. A little bit more about Aristotelian physics. Starting with this center chart here. The corrupt and temporary and changing world that we live on was composed of 4 elements: air, fire, earth, and water. Now these elements could combine in various amounts to give us different substances that we see and give us different behaviors. For instance, it's obvious that water and air are related, and there's 2 different ways in which things can be related, in terms of its wetness or in terms of its warmth, temperature type scale. And all these things get combined in this very clever description of what's happening on our planet. For instance, we know that if you added warmth to water, you can get air. And anybody who's boiled a pot of water dry understands this. That's exactly what's happened to it. You had water here, you added heat, and now you've got air. Gone. And you've got a burnt pot. If you add a little bit of earth to fire when it's escaping, you can see it's rising above the air. It wants to go quicker than, or higher than the air. It's more buoyant. So the air is on top of the fire when it's released from its substance, and then it flies up into the air. If you add a little bit of earth in with that to kind of drag it down a bit, you'll see that the fire will rise up. Oh, by the way, when we mix a bit of earth in with fire, we call that smoke. And so when it rises up, it'll find its natural level, its natural height in the sky, and then you'll see the smoke rises to this level and then flattens out. Perfectly good understanding of what's going on here. These people were explaining their natural world. And here's the way in which Aristotle and et al. Were describing this. Earth is the heaviest of this. Notice these triangles of earth and water are pointed downward. The ones of air and fire are pointed upward. These two substances had levity. They were light. They wanted to go upwards. These two substances had gravitas. They wanted to go to the center of the universe. That's what heavy meant to these people. And Earth, being the heaviest, was the stuff that moved towards the center of the universe. In some sense, the lowest point of it, even though they're quite happy talking about a spherical universe. Water, not quite as much. Air, and then fire. So these guys, in some ways, were almost anticipating our modern concepts of buoyancy and putting it into place here and trying to make sense of their world. The dividing line of this corrupt, temporary, messy world was the orbit of the moon. So in lots of ancient texts, you'll hear them talking about sublunary and superlunary realms. The moon's orbit was the boundary layer between all the corrupt stuff that is temporary and messy versus what we saw above it. What we saw above it was nice clockwork motion of planets and the sun and the stars revolving around us each day. The stars never changed. There was a permanence and a beauty to the heavens that we didn't see down here. And they recognized that it was so different up there that the stuff we talked about here that's down here, that can't be. This stuff doesn't work that way. Above the moon, things had to be drastically different. It was another world. And they realized they needed to talk about the material that's up there. They gave it the name ether, which, when you think about it, is a pretty good parallel for the way in which we talk about dark matter now. We have no access to it. We don't know exactly what it is. But by observing the behaviors in the heaven, we can say a few things about it. For instance, we recognize that ether was incredibly lightweight, perhaps weightless. It was also very rigid. It could keep an amazing shape of these spheres. And it was also transparent, and it was capable of carrying along materials such as planets. So, like dark matter, we could say some stuff about it, but we haven't gotten our hands on it yet, and for future investigations. Here's what they were all struggling with their theories. This is the spring of 1997. If you were to plot the position of Mars over the spring of 97 to July, you would come up with that sort of line. Mars had started back here, moved in the natural way from west to east across the background stars. That's how planets move. But then it came, slowed up, stopped, turned around, went backwards for a few months, then stopped again, and then continued forward. This is what we call a retrograde loop. And it was these retrograde loops that were driving the astronomers nuts. All their models, all their ways of trying to explain this were inadequate in one way or another. By the time you got to Ptolemy, the account was, yeah, you know what? It's good enough for us right now. And that persisted for 1,300 years that way. I took this slide out 3 times and put it back in 3 times. We'll put it in. You'll just have to stay after class, because this will take a while. This is my own term for this, cognitive dissonance in theories. But this is something, if you read Copernicus, Copernicus was really bothered by this. Over on the left, we have Aristotle-type physical accounts of what the cosmology is like. You've got planets circling the Earth. These shells are obviously too thin to do the job. We needed thicker shells to encase these little circles that we needed to get better motion into our models to help mimic what we saw in the sky. This is just a more stylized version of this here. So this is what the physicists were talking about. This is what they said was really going on. The astronomers didn't want to work with this cumbersome 3-dimensional stuff. All they needed to do was predict where and when the planets were going to be found. We didn't need all this nonsense. So they started to develop ideas like this. This is practically what Ptolemy gave us in the way of his account. It's, in some ways, abstracted from the reality over here. It's simplified. It's stripped down. And if you keep getting rid of each of these little mechanisms that get symbolized here, you eventually just get down to the planets and talk about where they're located, and then you get this wonderful spirograph effect of exactly where the planets would be found. Now, there's a line between here because these were supposed to be the abstractions. These were in some ways schematic drawings for what was really going on. It helped them to deal with it. Unfortunately, over time, mechanisms and devices were added to the abstraction that wouldn't allow you to transcribe it back into the physical models in a very easy way. So it's more... They won. So what you've got going here is a situation where the physical model was supposed to be the reality, and this was an abstraction just to help you grind out calculations. It was the instrumentalist viewpoint. Now what's happened here is over time, so many things were just done at this level that couldn't be transcribed back to this level. So it was more than just a simplification going on here. There was other understandings, a different way of understanding it being talked about on this side. And if I had more time, I could give you more examples of exactly what I'm getting at, but we're kind of pressed. So, what happens over time that's quite interesting, and especially once we get to Copernicus, this realistic view of everything starts to get eroded and fades away. And this stuff that was supposed to have been just an abstraction, it starts to look more real. It gets reified in the technical sense of, all of a sudden, these loop-de-loops are supposed to be what the planets are really doing. This stuff, well, yeah, we're supposed to pay homage to that, but that's a little tricky to do. So, the details of the Ptolemaic system. There will be a test. Here's the same thing that you just saw on the other page. And what it is here's the Earth, off-center of the first great sphere. The center of this sphere, which is the track of the smaller sphere, this line is called the deferent. That's the large circle that we almost intuitively think of as an orbit. The small little sphere with its little circle going around and around on it is called the Eppie Cycle. So, deferent and Eppie Cycle. These we owe to people like Hipparchus and some of the earlier astronomers. Now, this little maneuver of setting the Earth off from the center of the circle, this is what we call the eccentric. This offset allows us to talk about something that we saw in the planets. At certain points in their orbit, they looked like they were speeding past the Earth. At other points in their orbit, they were moving slower. By putting the Earth over to this side, this appearance of how fast it, remember, this is uniform circular motion, but if it's further away from you, it'll look slower to you. If it's up close to you, it goes by angularly quicker. So, by putting the Earth offset from the center, you're able to sort of better mimic what was going on with the planets, where they seem to be moving faster and moving slower. And it could also explain how bright the planet was. It's closer to us now. It should look bright. And then there's this point, which is going to take a little bit more explanation. This point is the one, as you can see it up here, it's called the equant. This is the bothersome point that we're going to investigate further in its own little examination. So I won't take up time with that now. But remember, our axiom that we're working with is uniform circular motion through all of this. And of course, you can abstract from this little model to talking again about the little spirogram type signs, which represents the planet that's being carried along in the Eppie Cycle, which is being carried around in the deferent. Okay, so Copernicus is born. He's born into the period we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of Western thought. Anyone recognize that one? Leonardo da Vinci's flying machine. He was one of the people that was around at this time creating all his wonderful things. Western European technology had allowed it to build ships that allowed it to start sailing all over the world. This being Christopher Columbus's fleet heading for America. And here's a quote that kind of summed up a healthy attitude towards things. The theory of eccentrics and epicycles is considered as established because thereby the sensible appearances of the heavenly movements can be explained. Not, however, as if this proof were sufficient, for as much as some other theory might explain them. So, here's our best account, but don't hold us to it. Now, that was St. Thomas Aquinas, who was trying to integrate our modern understanding of the world within Catholicism. He was trying to bring the two of these things together. And notice the confusing dates here. He wrote this in the 1200s, but it was published in 1485 and became well known. So that's why I've got both dates up there. I just love this picture. Raphael in about the year 1508. What had happened by this point was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Catholic Church that had split off years and years earlier. The Ottoman Turks had overrun Constantinople in the year 1453. Now what happened at that point was all the Christians that were living there, they booted out of there and came west, bringing with them all their books, all the stuff that they had access to. And one of the things they had access to was Greek stories and historical accounts of Greek culture. And Western Europe became quite enamored with the Greek culture. And this picture from Raphael kind of exudes that enamored attitude that they had about this. It was a case of, wow, they had a wonderful society. It had some sense of democratic behavior. It was progressive. It was relatively peaceful for quite some time. You had a society that built shining cities on the hill. It was full of very clever people doing very clever things. This picture, even though these aren't just regular folks standing around here. This is Plato. This is Aristotle. This is poor Diogenes resting on the steps as he spent his days looking for an honest man and couldn't find one. So everybody in this picture is symbolic of an age that the Europeans wished to recapture. They liked the idea that, first of all, this was a relatively egalitarian society, if you weren't a slave or of those categories, and that it was progressive. And it did this all without nasty authority. namely the church. Along with this movement in terms of Renaissance secularism and humanism, there's two related ideas. One is the anti-scholasticism. And to symbolize this, I picked a quote from Sir Francis Bacon, who was the Carl Sagan of his... No, not Carl Sagan. He's more of a Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I'll just read this out, and you should get the idea of what he's talking about. If any human being earnestly desires to push on to new discoveries instead of just retaining and using the old stuff, to win victories over nature as a worker rather than over hostile critics as a disputant, to attain, in fact, clear and demonstrative knowledge instead of attractive and probable theories, we invite him as a true son of science to join our ranks. They were sick and tired of the scholastic education system that they had, which essentially said, you know, things are pretty much sorted out, we've got it all figured. If you want to know, consult one of the ancient experts, and if you think there's still an argument to be had here, pick another ancient expert and just have the two of their arguments fight it out. No, these people weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to move forward with things. Neoplatonism, of course, Plato being one of the Greeks that they rediscovered at the time, they were also enamored with a lot of what he said. And I've picked Kepler as representing that idea. And he was talking about how I propose to show that God, in creating the universe and arranging the spheres, had in view the 5 regular solids of geometry, and fixed by their dimensions the number, proportions, and motions of the spheres. If this is starting to sound like numerological mysticism, you're right. This borders on it. But the whole idea that the universe could somehow be constructed along the lines of mathematics and geometry is something that we still hold to this day. When we look at a sunflower plant, it's Fibonacci sequences that we want to use to describe these things. So Platonism hasn't left us. If anything, we've got more of it than we ever did. And that's where people like science fiction author Michael Flynn are lamenting, saying, heliocentrism triumphed, first of all, because Neoplatonic number mysticism had become very popular during the Renaissance. And Platonists equate mathematical elegance with physical evidence. So this was almost him bitterly complaining about the way in which some arguments in science are going. Ptolemy is our great astronomer from the past. Now, you may not realize that he was also one of the world's, ancient world's, great cartographers. This is a map that he drew during his lifetime, showing Europe, here's Spain and all of Europe, here's the Mediterranean, North Africa, Arabia, and parts of Asia. This was the known world to them, and he has a relatively decent map about what's going on there. Now jump to the year 1550, which is the time of Copernicus, and this is now the map of the world. Ptolemy's map is this bit over here. Look at all the new lands we know about now. These are lands that have been discovered by those explorers that have been traveling all over the world. Vasco da Gama, Magellan, and Columbus, who gave us this new knowledge of the frontiers. Oh, and speaking of Columbus, we have to get rid of one of the worst pieces of Whig history that we have to deal with. And that's the notion that people at this time and earlier times believed in a flat earth. Nobody really believed in a flat earth. If you were an educated person from Aristotle onwards, you didn't believe in a flat earth. You knew it was round. You had all kinds of arguments you learned in school showing that it was round. You have to be careful where you're getting your historical sources. And there's probably more flat earthers alive today than there was during the Middle Ages. I grabbed this little graphic off of a poster for a conference. I don't know if this was the one in Edmonton or the one in Indiana, but it was some backwater place. That was hosting a flat Earth convention. Okay, here's our new timeline for the revolution that we want to talk about, Copernican Revolution. Here we have Copernicus' life being terminated here in 1543. About the time Tycho Brahe was born, Galileo comes in here, Kepler comes in here, and then Newton comes in here. This blocked off period is not all that significant to us. We're actually going to go a little bit forward of that, but this gives you kind of a perspective as to where in which you'll find people. Here's Da Vinci, Columbus, Shakespeare, Milton, Francis Bacon, all the people that we're going to talk about in this Renaissance into the early modern period are found here. Now, here's some events that we have to really take account of. First of all, the movable-type printing press that was invented in the year 1440. This is so important, I've got a whole slide dedicated to it. We've already talked about the fall of Constantinople. I've put in here, for instance, that Ptolemy's Almagest, Ptolemy's big book, was unknown pretty much to the Western world until it got printed up after it was dragged out of Constantinople and brought over to the Western world. And then they cranked out copies of it and everyone said, oh, so this is what he really meant. They've been speculating about Ptolemaic astronomy for centuries without really understanding what the master himself had in mind. I've got this date and this characteristic put together, but you have to realize amongst the scholarly, they've been using Arabic numerals long before the date of 1494. I picked that date, 1494, because that was the date of a huge publication on mathematics. It was actually by a guy, I can't remember his name, but he's known as the father of accounting. Anyways, it was with this publication of this book that everybody realized, yeah, get rid of the X, V, I's, and let's start doing multiplication. During this period of time, from the 1500s right on through this, well, most of what's here in these dark ages is what's known as the Protestant Reformation, the breaking away of and the breaking apart of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. There are several astronomical events that happened in this period that have huge impact. Tycho's Nova of 1572 and the Great Comet of 1577. We'll talk about those individually as well. We finally got the calendar reform that's been asked for. One of the popes, when Copernicus was alive, said, you know, our calendar is really getting out of date. Easter is really getting pushed away from the season it used to be in. We got to update this Julian calendar. Copernicus was asked to actually help out with that, and he said, you know what, astronomy is in such a mess, I think you should hold off on that until we get our house in order. And Copernicus had nothing to do with the creation of the Gregorian calendar. It was finally done, what's that, 30-some years after his death? And of course, the development of the telescope in 1608 and the decree against Galileo in 1616. We'll hopefully get to those in future events. But I just wanted to show you this map about printing press. The movable-type printing press gets going in 1440. By the year 1500, they had cranked out over 20 million books on these machines, scattered all over Europe. Here's a map just showing where they were found. The darker the color, the sooner it was put up. The larger the circle, the bigger the press, the more books it was cranking out. Now, with this mass communication, we were allowed to have things formed like dispersed societies. People who thought the same all over the place could get together and talk about things. An interesting thing, I was greatly entertained by this, was when you mailed a letter to another professor someplace, arguing some point, at some point all your letters got collected on this subject and then published. Talk about privacy laws. So you had a situation where so much of what was published back then was really arguments. Private arguments between astronomers or philosophers, and eventually you could read all about it. And of course this fostered the emergence of scientific societies that we're able to deal with. Okay, finally get to our boy Copernicus. What's really important here, I think, is the date of his death, because it's also the date of his one great publication. He had one small book called the Commentariologus that was done about 30 years earlier that announced that, hey, I'm working on this big project having to do with a new system, but you got to wait. The book was published and just available. He was supposedly, maybe this is apocryphal, this story, but supposedly he was handed a completed printed book just before he died. Some say it was a few weeks before he died. Some say he died with the book in his hands. This is the way in which our history gets embellished. Anyways, 1543 is the date in which our most complete and essentially our work on Copernicus is delivered to the world. Here's a couple of points that indicate what he thought was so important about it. We discover a marvelous commensurability of the universe and harmonious linkage between the motion of the spheres and their size, such can be found in no other way. Thus we perceive why the direct and retrograde arcs appear greater in Jupiter than in Saturn and smaller than in Mars, and why this reversal in direction appears more frequently in Saturn than in Jupiter and more rarely than in Mars and Venus than have Mercury. All these phenomena proceed from the same cause, which is the Earth's motion. What Copernicus is appealing to here is his theory's explanatory power. He's not saying it's a better theory, more accurate or anything. He's saying, look what I can make sense of in my account. He also knew about its Achilles heel, and we'll be talking lots about his Achilles heel if I ever get to do another talk around here. The massive bulk of the Earth does indeed shrink to insignificance in comparison with the size of the heavens. He was aware that if he was going to set the Earth in motion, there'd be consequences. And consequences he knew were going to be bad for his theory. So he's already starting to prep things open here to see how well he can have this accounted for. And of course, here is his little theory right here, where he puts the sun in the middle, throws the Earth up into the ether, and has the planets all ordered out. We'll be saying a bit more about that later too. So what was the initial reaction to the publication in 1543 of De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium? How's that for Latin? First off, that title to the book is not the title that Copernicus wanted. He wanted to just call it On the Revolutions, De Revolutionibus. But they added the other title to make sure that everybody sort of knew what it was about. And when they used the word celestial spheres, Orbium Celestium, he didn't like that, or his students didn't like that, because they thought, you're starting to make this sound like all he was doing was model building instead of describing a whole new cosmology. So he really didn't like this title. And one of the things that happened was one of his students, that was a guy who, this firecracker of a student who actually convinced Copernicus to publish. Copernicus was really reluctant. He started working on this, he worked on this book for 30 years. And he was reluctant to publish, not because he was afraid of the church, which is what you'll read about in all kinds of historical accounts. He wasn't afraid of the church. He was afraid of the other scientists, about being laughed at. He never thought his theory was complete yet. He never solved all these problems, like the problem of the size of his world, etc. So that was the reason. But then once he realized he was just about dead, yeah, okay, let's wrap this up and get it published. The Gregorian calendar that was finally being worked on by Christopher Clavius used the Copernican model to generate the data to help them sort out the new calendars and predict when the Easters were going to be from then on forward. and to work with what they needed to do, how many leap years did they need to put in, and when they needed to do it. That was all worked out in the Copernican system. The Copernican system was really good for being able to do the math. It was an easier system to work with. Erasmus Reinhold actually generated a whole new set of tables, which were positions, numerical charts that just showed you the position of each and every thing that was to be found in the sky. And he used the Copernican model to generate his charts. But being where he was in Germany, he took the system back the other way, and after he worked with it in the Copernican system, he reconverted it back so it was backwards compatible with the old Ptolemaic system. And then you've got this curious claim by Arthur Kessler, who's a modern-day historian, who looked at this period and said, geez, you know, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of reaction at all to Copernicus's book. For instance, this is not the cover of Copernicus's book. This Index Librorum Prohibitorum, this is the list of banned books by the Catholic Church. And Copernicus's book never makes it on this list. Not for 70 years. The Catholic Church was fine with the book. Didn't have any real issues with that at all. What happens is that this book kind of landed with a thud, or at least that's what Arthur Kessler was saying it did. He actually claimed, this is the greatest book in history that no one ever read. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially what happens is, another modern-day historian, Owen Gingrich, thought, really? Could that be right? Did nobody read this? He was working at the Smithsonian Science Institute, had a year of sabbatical off there. He went all over the world and then got money to turn it into a 3-year project. He went and looked, and this was back in the 1970s, he went and looked at every copy that he could find on the planet of De Revolutionibus, and looked at the books to see, well, are these pristine copies? Or, you know, is the binding cracked? He wanted to see if anyone really read them. And he did find out that, oh, yeah, they were read all right, and very much so. The margins, big margins in the old books, the margins were filled with comments, etc. about things. Oddly enough, well, I'll get to that part later too. So, the reactions of the less scientific world was a little bit more predictable. For instance, this is Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation, who was no fan of Catholics, but still was no fan of what was happening here either. People gave ear to an upstart astrologer who strove to show that the earth revolves, not the heavens. This fool wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. Not a very good reception. This is from a far enough perspective forward in time that allows us to get a nice summary of how the regular people reacted to the Copernican theory. Of all discoveries and opinions, none may have exerted a greater effect on the human spirit than the doctrine of Copernicus. Never, perhaps, was a greater demand made on mankind. For by this admission, so many things vanished in mist and smoke. What became of our Eden? Earth was the center of the universe. Now it's kicked up into just another orbit around the sun. The sun was now placed at the center of the universe. And what about the testimony of our senses? Everything we'd been talking about in our sciences up till now was empirical science. It was direct observations of things that we were looking at. I know this room isn't moving. I can see it's not moving. I would feel it if it's moving. We had to now deny all of our sensory data. All of our common sense was now dismissed as being erroneous. And no wonder contemporaries of Copernicus had a problem with this. So said Goethe in 1808. We're still reacting to Copernicus to this day. Here's a quote from an author and activist. Modern neuroses began with the discoveries of Copernicus. Science made men feel small by showing him that the earth was not the center of the universe. And books are being printed to this day on this subject. I don't want to waste any more time on this. At the other end of the spectrum, those who are particularly involved in the human condition thought the whole issue wasn't even worth bothering about either. So, what is the Copernican situation that we have to deal with here? Was there really a crisis for Copernicus to react to create this whole new theory? There's still no consensus on exactly what this might be. Almost every historian, no matter what their position is, will admit saying, we really don't know why Copernicus was motivated to bring forth the theory he did. So we've got a bit of a mystery left there. Owen Gingerich said, well, there wasn't a real crisis in astronomy. These notions from other historians like Thomas Kuhn and such who said, well, the problem, the crisis that he was dealing with was, go read King Alfonso of Spain, who was responsible, commissioned the Alphonsine tables from 150 years earlier than this. And their tables were getting out of date, time to get new tables. And he said, when he was presented with the finished work, he paid for all these astronomers to write up new tables. He was presented with the finished work, and he was showed the Ptolemaic system that they had used, all those Eppie cycles and deferents going around each other. And Alfonso was supposedly said, geez, I wish God would have consulted with me before he created this universe, because I could have recommended some simpler solutions. So, was the astronomy just before Copernicus overly complicated? Gingerich, again the intrepid historian that he is, went and worked through a whole bunch of the tables, such as the Alphonsine tables, and some of the works of Sacrobosco and Regiomontanus and a few of these people that were astronomers, big-time astronomers just before Copernicus, and realized that the work that they cranked out, we've got computers now, so it's really easy to compare their work. If you use a simple Ptolemaic system, the way Ptolemy originally developed it, you get their results. They didn't use Eppie cycles on Eppie cycles and all the burdensome things that some historians think was happening just before Copernicus came along. Astronomy wasn't really in that big a problem. Yeah, calendars were out of date, but you could have updated that within the Ptolemaic system. You didn't need to make a whole new system to do that, even though, yeah, it was great to do it in that system because the calculations were easier, and that's what Christopher Clavius had done. So, where was the crisis here? Copernicus said there was a crisis. He said what I was faced with here was too many different models, too many different ways of interpreting this. We weren't even sure which order some of the planets should go in. Should it go Moon, Mercury, Venus, or should it go Moon, Venus, Mercury? We weren't even sure the order of some of the planets at this time. So he was frustrated with some of that. That didn't seem to bother anyone else because everyone had their favorite model. They could crank out the predictions, make their horoscopes, because that's what was important at this time. I mean, who was reading those charts and tables that were being ground out? It was the astrologers, the people that were desperately needing updated data here so that they could predict the next plague that was to come through. So, Robert Westman, another great Copernican historian, said, well, there wasn't a problem in astronomy, but there sure as heck was a problem with the astrology side of things. It was failing miserably. The weather forecasts were about as good as what we get, and the medical advice that they were hoping to get on things like plagues was not working out that well. They were still being wiped out on a regular basis. And so you had a situation where the astrological side of things was a total disaster. And then in the year 1496, a fellow by the name of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, we'll call him Pico, wrote a scathing attack on astrology, totally trashed it, and ridiculed astronomers / astrologers for saying, You guys don't even know what you're doing. You guys can't even order the planets consistently here. How do you think that there's causal effects from out there are supposed to be doing these things due to their positions and whatever mumbo jumbo, when you guys can't even decide which order to put the planets in? Now this stung a lot of astronomers / astrologers. The question is, did it bother our boy Copernicus? Because Copernicus, as far as we can tell, from all of his written work and the historical stuff we can see, wasn't big on astrology to begin with. Now, Robert Westman has just written a book called The Copernican Question, in which he tries to evaluate to what extent this bugged Copernicus and then led him forward with this. And he comes out saying, oh yeah, Copernicus was as deeply involved in the astrological side as anybody else, and he was trying to help out the whole enterprise by coming up with a new version that they could work with easier, simpler, and hopefully more effectively. Other historians, such as Noel Storvelt and Ed Rosen, if Ed Rosen was still alive, would just completely condemn that. They didn't think that that was a right thing to attribute to Copernicus at all. So we don't really know what motivated Copernicus in those situations. We do know, for instance, that he wasn't reluctant to come forward with his ideas once he had it there, and he wasn't one that was going to be too worried about the way in which his account was to be taken. He thought he was dealing with something new and important that was significant. He obviously wasn't ignored, but when Gingrich went through all those copies of De Revolutionibus, he found that the first part of the book, where Copernicus goes through all of his heliocentric stuff and lays out the new model, there's no commentary in there. It's like nobody cared about the first section. All this marginalia stuff that he found written all had to do with the mechanics, his system. That's the stuff that interested all the astronomers, because that was the stuff that they were going to be able to find useful, to make use of. So, we've got a radical departure for our physics. We've got a question of whether or not we should be following the Aristotelian models versus the Ptolemaic models. And we've got this situation about whether retrograde motion is something real or not. And let's get to some of this stuff where we can talk about it. For instance, here's Copernicus' system right here with the sun in the center. Here's Ptolemy's map, kind of the scale of the whole thing. Notice the big, messy Earth in this one. It gets reduced to a nice little dot right in here. A little dot, much easier to set in motion around the sun. The moon, of course, going around the Earth still. Wait, a moon going around the Earth? Well, how's that supposed to happen now? We understood in this system why the moon would orbit here. It was the innermost sphere around the center of the universe. Now you've got the moon somehow still going around the Earth, even though this is the center of the universe. How do we drag it along? What keeps it with us? They had no real answer for that. They just, well, okay, we're going to talk about little spheres now and such. So there was genuine scientific objections to some of the things that Copernicus was proposing. And of course, we had the Earth rotating in 24 hours, so we had a story to tell there as well. Wait a second, we're moving, and they had a good idea of the size of the Earth, so we're dealing with tremendous speeds. We're moving in that direction at this latitude here at about 1,000 kilometers an hour. Where's the breeze? We're doing 1,000 clicks. Why don't I feel that wind of the east? I should feel this. No answers to this kind of thing, except, well, maybe it's carried along with us, maybe there's other issues. When you go to a tower and drop a ball down, the tower has moved over. So where does the ball fall? Does it fall straight down in this case, but the tower's moved over so that it looks like the ball fell behind it? The top of the tower is moving quicker than the bottom of the tower. So does the ball land ahead of the tower? Or does it still fall straight down because somehow things are balancing out? They had no idea how to really argue this because they didn't have a physics of motion that could do the job here. So everybody was batting each other over the heads with different ideas of this. And they talked in terms of cannons too, because cannons were the latest warfare at the time. And so they're talking about, you fire a cannon east, does the ball land further because it's got that extra motion with it? Or does it, if you fired it west, does it land further from the cannon because the cannon's moved over this much, the earth came up this way, and the cannon ball falls boom? Which way do your intuitions take you? And this is the way in which they were struggling, trying to sort out exactly what was going on when you put the earth in motion. It just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to a lot of them. One thing that was a good triumph for Copernicus was his account of retrograde motion. This is the fall of the year 2000. So in August of 2000, Saturn was here, and it went into its retrograde loop, and there it was at the end of the year. Here's Jupiter. At the beginning, it was up here, it went through this motion, and this is where it was found at the end of the year 2000. And if you recognize this, this is the Pleiades. These two planets were together up in the constellation Taurus in the year 2000. Boy, I wish I'd have spent more time observing back then, and had the telescopes that I have now. But it would have been really great to have had such a beautiful view of them high overhead. Brian was telling us about how they're going to get together this summer, but they're going to be so low through the soup of our atmosphere, hardly be worth looking at. Book a trip to Australia. Here's the two accounts. This is Ptolemy's account, notice an Eppie Cycle, where the planet really does rotate backwards against the background stars and makes that retrograde loop. With Copernicus' system, there's no real motion of the planet backwards. It's always going forward. It's just an illusion of you on the Earth. The Earth is the blue dot here. This is the sun. The Earth passing it on the inside. So you're just watching this thing go backwards, like you would watch a car that you're passing on the highway. So this motion that they've struggled with mightily to try and sort out, Copernicus says, don't worry about it, boys, it's just an illusion. And it's due to this simple relative motion versus all the stuff that they had done to try and drag it out this way. A very peculiar thing that, again, is a triumph for the Copernican system is the way in which it accounts for the position of the sun during retrograde motion. Let's start over here with the Copernican model. Here's the Earth in blue going around. Here's the sun. Here's Mars. Now watch. When Earth catches up to Mars, passes it on the inside, and the retrograde motion is detected, the sun was directly opposite it. Coming around again, we'll let it do this. Notice the alignment that's coming up here. Sun, Earth, Mars. The reason that retrograde loops happened at opposition, and opposition is when the planet's there and the sun's there. The reason it happened at opposition was that's the natural order of things when you're passing something on the inside. It was a natural consequence. The location of the sun was a natural consequence of his theory. Whereas in the Ptolemaic theory, you had this Eppie Cycle loop in sort of the same place. The Earth is stationary, of course. Here comes Mars, does its retrograde loop, and yeah, the sun's opposite there. But there's no reason for it to be that way in the Ptolemaic system. The sun, as far as this is concerned, could have been anywhere. It just happens to be in that kind of configuration, Copernicus claimed, because this is the reality, and your theory here is just throwing up your hand saying, well, it's just a coincidence. And now we get to the total bugaboo of the early Ptolemaic account. I said that one of the reasons Ptolemy's account was so successful was that it employed an equin. Now, an equin is a point, okay, here's the Earth, here's your deferent, here's your Eppie Cycle. Now, This is uniform circular motion, as usual. So you'd think that the center of the Eppie cycle would be uniformly moving around this circle. When you make your model that way, it's going to fail. The cleverness of Ptolemy was to say, oh yeah, it's moving equally, but not from the point in the center of the circle. The equal motion that you're measuring or viewing is from this point, directly opposite the Earth on the other side of the center of the circle. That is the point at which the motion is deemed to be uniform. So that means if you started out here, and let's say it took you 4 years to go in an orbit. So in the first year, you'd go from there to here. In the second year, you'd go, oh, all this extra distance. So you had to be faster, moving faster at this point to get to this same angular point. Here's 90 degrees covered in 1 year. Here's 90 degrees covered in the second year. Here's 90 degrees covered in the third year. And then this small little bit covered in the fourth year. By this trick of terminology, talking about an equant, saying this is the point at which the motion looked uniform, Ptolemy was able to cheat the system here and have the motion of the Eppie cycle much quicker over here and much slower over here, even more so than the offset due to the eccentric would give you. Now this irked astronomers entirely. Like they're saying, how is this uniform circular motion anymore? Ptolemy, you should have been a tobacco company lawyer. What you're suggesting here is keeping the terminology correct, but the spirit of what you're talking about here is totally wrong. And they hated this. Copernicus hated this. And he came up with this little device, 2 uniform circles doing a thing. And notice, if you plunk the planet right here, you could get the planet to do something as simple as oscillate back and forth. This is known as a Tuzi cup, developed by a Persian astronomer 500 years before Copernicus. And he learned about it when all this stuff came across from Constantinople. And it was a device that allowed you to regularly move things back and forth with uniform circular motion, that's what's going on here, that allowed you to get rid of the equant. And everybody was cheering at this. Okay, good. We're back to our causal mechanism. It's all right now to talk about this stuff. I'm going to leave this apart. This is anticipation how this... The equant isn't necessarily totally evil because it has this characteristic of talking about areas that are swept out, and Kepler takes advantage of this later on. But we got to keep moving on here, or you'll miss your bedtime. So, Copernicus was arguing about a natural order of things. He thought that what you had here was the sun in the center, and the sun, and he talks about this in almost mystical terms too. The great giver of light, you know, our shining temple in the sky. We shouldn't just have it in a third or fourth orbit around the slovenly Earth. We'll give it the place of dignity it deserves. We'll put it on the throne of the center of the universe. And he talks that way in his book about the way in which he wants to put the sun in the center of it all. The problem of the moon being dragged around, well, we don't have to worry about the moon behaving like the planets anymore because the moon has now been deplanified. It's, to use Jacques Bourgeois' term, it's been kicked out of the list of planets. So it acts differently now. It's a satellite of the Earth, and so it's given this other status. And he has some justification for doing different things with the sun and the moon. All the rest of the planets show retrograde motion. There's 2 things that don't. The sun and the moon. They never show retrograde motion. They were kind of different even in Ptolemy's system. I've just outlined, says Copernicus, the way in which they are special in my system. His system allows you to talk about the way in which distances were covered. How Mars, okay, this is Earth here, and this is the circle of Mars going around here. Mars could be quite far away from the Earth at times, or look very close in our sky. In other words, where it's covering lots of distance in our sky, and looking much brighter. If you observe Mars over a couple of years, you'll realize the great range of brightness that Mars goes through. And a nice thing that he had in this system too was the idea that the scale of his model here was locked in. In the Ptolemaic system, you could fiddle about, make your difference a little bit bigger, and then the Eppie Cycle's a little smaller. You could fiddle with one planet or another. Copernicus thought it was an advantage, a virtue of his system, that you can't muck about like that without changing the whole thing. This is the way in which he thought it sort of smacked of reality. His system allowed you to do certain things in there, but only if you're willing to change the whole structure of it. That's where the sensation of reality that's coming in there. Copernicus also had an explanation for why Mercury and Venus never got that far from the sun. On the Ptolemaic system, he had this little contrivance saying, well, they're always kept in line on this sort of rod kind of thing. No real explanation going on there for how this was working. What you really had here was a totally artificial, ad hoc device to try and explain what was going on here. If you went back to Aristotelian physics, you could maybe talk about the ways in which the spheres were all kind of locked up and moving together. I don't know. I don't know of anyone that even tried this. It was just something that occurs to me when I was thinking of how to argue this stuff. With Copernicus' system, where this is Mercury going around the sun, this is Venus going around the sun, they're inferior planets. They don't get that far from the sun from the perspective of the Earth. It's a natural consequence of his system that those two planets are going to be close to the sun. And so if you're looking at Mercury and Venus this spring in the sky, you'd have seen Mercury come up, reach its furthest eastern elongation, and then descend back down towards the sun. Venus, in the meantime, is still rising up and will get further from the sun until it reaches its maximum eastern elongation, and then it will start plunging back towards the sun as it's coming in for inferior conjunction. So with the Copernican system, you had a natural explanation for this as opposed to this artificial contrivance of Ptolemy's. Now, Copernicus can't take the whole credit for this. Some people were bothered by all this stuff to begin with. And a fellow by the name of Martianus Capella, 200 years before Copernicus, he already had made that modification to the system. Rather than worry about whether Mercury and Venus, what order they were in between the moon and the sun, he had them starting to orbit the sun. So people were already anticipating a lot of the things that Copernicus ended up doing later anyway. And here's a lot of legwork done by some people trying to determine the complexity of the two systems. This is supposedly to the same degree of accuracy. You needed enough spheres to account for certain motions, and so they did both of them. And you can see it's sort of a wash. There is almost as many circles in the Ptolemaic system, if you counted them all up, as there are in the Copernican model. If anything, the Copernican model required more circles than did the Ptolemaic one. So all those claims about Ptolemy's system being overly complicated and the simpler, cleaner system of Copernicus taking over, no, it's not true. So, where are we in all this? What sort of revolution have we got going so far? Remember, we're only to Copernicus. We've got, Tycho and Kepler and Galileo and etc. to come in this whole long story. But we've got a model that wasn't new. Copernicus knew about Aristarchus's stuff. And there was the Capellan model before that and a few others. Thomas Digges over in England, when he was made aware of the Copernican system, said, all right, somebody's finally revived the theory of the Pythagoreans. because the Pythagoreans also had a system that sort of worked that way. And he kept referring to it as the Pythagorean system, which would have pissed off Copernicus had he still been around. So it wasn't a new theory. It contradicted the physics and never provided an alternative account. If you got rid of the uniform circular motion, you'd be in real trouble. But he got rid of that whole part of Aristotelian physics that had to do with the corruptibility of the Earth. And now he's flung that up into space, and we don't have an alternate explanation for how that could work. And then, of course, it makes novel predictions, but no novel predictions that could be done at this time. And it wasn't simpler, it wasn't more accurate, and it even used two-part models. I was quite disturbed to learn about this. When Copernicus goes to calculate right ascension, he uses one set of equations. To calculate declination, he's got another separate model for this. In what sense is this a model of reality if you've got these two different ideas going on here? So it didn't work out that way. So it did provide natural explanations for retrograde motions. It explained the speed and brightness of planets. It gave us explanations for Venus and Mercury, and made calculations easier, and it got rid of equals. So, in concluding all of this, what is the greatest attraction of the Copernican system? And I think it comes down to his student, Joachim Rheticus, who came out with this plea for tolerance for his master's system. It's, with regard to the apparent motions of the sun and moon, it is perhaps possible to deny what is said about the motion of the earth. But if anyone desires to look either on the order and harmony of the system of the spheres, or to the ease and elegance and complete explanation of the causes of the phenomena, by no other hypotheses will he demonstrate more neatly and correctly the apparent motions of the remaining planets. And so, what I'm about to show you cannot be unseen. Once you see this, all the arguments and explanations are going to fall away, because when you watch the two systems in action, you will easily come to a preferred system. Now, I followed these little balls around on this system, and it isn't exactly quite right. This model isn't quite where it should be in all of this. Now, the interesting thing about this, too, is that, okay, in modern times, I can make animated images like this. But what could they do to convince astronomers back then that this was the way in which you were to prefer things? Those guys were sharp. They were very good. They could, from their charts and what they were doing, they could see this in their minds. I am quite convinced of that. These people knew how these things moved and could imagine the way in which there was so many complications where you would lose track of things in this model, whereas this one kept your mind clear on things. And so, this is what we have with Copernicus now. So far, remember this is just up to the point of Copernicus. We've got no real decision on whether or not this should be considered a realist theory versus an instrumentalist theory. There's no real specific scientific method being described here, as some historians want to claim. There's no demonstration of the proof of things. Essentially, he's just offering, saying, hey, look what you can do with my theory. It's an inductive kind of argument, saying, I can explain more than you could get this way. This is the value of it. He's got a bold prediction about the order and scale of planets that suggests that it somehow smacks of reality, but doesn't really make the claim. There's certainly no demarcation of astronomy from pseudosciences like astrology. If anything, these things are closer together than they've ever been. He's given their whole enterprise new life. The moon and the stars and the sun were made different. We'll get into more of that if you get to Tycho. And he's got this bizarre sort of mystical notion about nobility of rest in the sun. And of course, his great ace in the hole is appeal to elegance. And that's where the scientific community was back then. Notice I haven't talked about any objections from the church. All that kind of stuff comes later when you get that shit disturber Galileo in this equation. But as it sits right now, they're not an issue with this. What you've got is scientists debating the results in a very scientific manner. And so far, kind of nice. It's a kook theory that allows us to do things, but no, doesn't work. Okay, thank you for indulging me the extra time.
Nice job, Gary. Okay, so now that your heads are full, we will continue the meeting at Boston Pizza, just down Pembina, where you can fill up on other things. Also, there are free magazines and whatnot to take with